This is Distant Replay, the podcast that goes back in time to relive all the greatest events that we witnessed in sports. From upsets, to championships, to cultural moments, we discuss it all. Coming up on today's episode.
After reviewing the play, the quarterback's arm was going forward. It is an incomplete pass. Second and 10 on the 42. Wow.
Well, it's not going to take any explaining to figure out what this show is going to be about. This episode, this is probably the only time we're going to use a highlight from a game that's an actual referee decision. And it's all about the tuck rule in this episode of Distant Replay. Welcome in. I am Ben George, alongside Mike Noto. Mike, I can't wait for your reaction to this, being an NFL guy and being up in the New England area around Patriots fans. But this game, it was fun going back and reliving this one.
It sure was. There's so many things from this game that you forget. And this game just brought all those memories flooding back, particularly painful for me as a Jets fan. The Jets had some role in kind of what went down here previous to this game and what will go down post this game. And it's just like, talk about reliving a house of horrors. Like this is where it all started. This is where it all started, almost 20 years of misery with the Patriots beating the Jets' brains in. It all started here.
Well, we're going to get into the game in just a second, but let me remind you what we do on this show. It's Distant Replay. We go back, we relive one game. We rewatch it start to finish as it originally aired years later. As we go through, Mike and I jot down our thoughts, make notes, and then we're going to go through it pre-game, kind of setting the stage for what this game's about, why we chose this game. Then we'll get into the game discussion, talking about plays, the broadcast, all the stuff that happened within the game. And then the case for tonight, I think a lot of the discussion will be around the aftermath, as Mike kind of alluded to there to start the show. So that's how it all works. Remember, subscribe on Apple Podcasts. Please do that. While you're there, you can also subscribe on any podcasting app that you choose to use. But leave us a review if you can as well. Also, you can follow us on Twitter at Distant Podcast. You can email us at distantpodcast@gmail.com, and then also our website, distantreplaypodcast.com, where we're going to put up show notes. We'll have a link to the game if you want to actually go back and watch it yourself, plus other notes and nuggets on our website as well. So be sure to visit that and check it out. So let's dive right into this episode. It is the AFC Divisional Playoff game, Oakland Raiders versus the New England Patriots, January 19th, 2002. So why do we pick this game, Mike?
Quite simply, it's the most controversial replay reversal ever in the history of football. I don't think there's one that's even close to it. All right, that's number one. The first thing that comes to my mind as far as why this game is such a big deal. And secondly, just the, as we alluded to before a little bit, just the wide-ranging ramifications of this game and the impact it had on the NFL, not only the very next season following this one, but also just pretty much the next 2 decades since, with the rise of the Patriots dynasty.
This is the tuck rule game, as you mentioned. It was a reversal that really changed the course of history for football. So setting the table a little bit more, what did you know about this matchup going in? For me, I knew the matchup. I knew it was the Raiders. Remembered the Raiders-Patriots. Remembered it being the tuck rule game. I remember Vinatieri made a pretty important kick. That's kind of the gist of what I knew about this game. I didn't realize it was Brady's first game and a lot of other stuff that happened around this game, but that's kind of what my background was on this. How much about this game did you know going back and looking at it?
Going back before we started watching, what I remembered was the weather conditions, a snowy game. The only reason that stuck out to me was, again, I can't hide my Jets fandom during this podcast, but the Jets for 2 weeks in a row, the last regular season game and then the wild card round, of course, had to go to Oakland and play at Oakland. And then the Patriots, in the first divisional night game ever, get a West Coast team heading east with a high-powered offense playing in the snow in 25-degree weather. Yeah. So that always stuck with me, that, wow, the Patriots get this team in cold weather. I never forgot that. And I also just knew what this game led to that season. You forget about the AFC Championship game that followed, and, of course, the Super Bowl against the Rams. Both things I'm sure we'll get into later. But that's what I think of when I think of this game. What I knew about this game is, the direct correlation it had to some later outcomes of this particular season.
A couple things of note for this game. It was Tom Brady's very first playoff game. Also, his first season as a starter. I mean, this game, I don't really think about that when I remember this game at all. I don't remember this being his first playoff game. I just think of what Tom Brady is now, what he's become, and just kind of think that's how it always was. That isn't the case, which we'll talk about. This was also the last game at Foxboro Stadium. I don't really remember that one bit, that this was kind of a farewell for this stadium at all. It might have been mentioned once in the broadcast, so it wasn't a huge deal. Maybe it's a bigger deal now as stadiums get upgraded and stuff, but that was another thing of note. But I thought it was interesting, too, going into this game, Mike, that the Patriots only played – this was just their second game in 27 days when they took the field against the Raiders.
Yeah, they had a very rare late season bye. Then they had their regular season finale. Then they had a week off because they earned a bye in the playoffs. I mean, that's something that, with the way the NFL schedule is done these days, you'll never see. You never see a bye that late in the season, the second week, before the season ends. So did that have a role in them being able to prepare for the Raiders? I mean, I would say so. I mean, they knew there was only a certain amount of teams they'd have to prepare for in the playoffs, Raiders being one of them. Obviously, they couldn't predict the weather conditions that would impact the Raiders' offense. But yeah, that's the first and last time I bet you that's ever happened.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about this game, everybody that already thinks there's a conspiracy to help the Patriots and the Patriots just find a way to win by kind of working in the gray area. I mean, this game had everything. All right, it had the scheduling, a Week 16 bye to kind of get them rested and prepared for the playoff, and it had the referees making this decision in the game. I mean, it all kind of came together, the perfect storm to happen. So before we start talking about the game, where were you when this game happened? I was in college in Tuscaloosa. I don't remember much more than that. I don't know where I was, but where were you watching this game?
So as you saw in the game, there was obviously a snowstorm throughout the entire game. Of course, the snow didn't let up, for 1 minute during game action. So this was a storm that was already rolling through where I lived in Connecticut. It was about a week before I went back to the college that I attended. So I was watching this game in my parents' basement.
Nice, very nice. Well, that sets the stage for tonight's discussion on the game, the actual game. So let's get into it a little bit here. Let's start off broadcast-wise. I was impressed that this was CBS's top crew. I mean, these guys, for the most part, still around. Greg Gumbel, Phil Simms, and your boy Armin Katayan on the sidelines for this game.
Yeah. So you had, like I said, you had Gumbel and Simms. So Simms's voice and Gumbel's voice we've all been hearing for the last 20, 25 years. Those two are solid. Another nugget from the broadcast was Jim Nantz in the studio.
Yeah.
This is before we get Jim Nantz on play-by-play calls, which is what I think we all think of him as. The other AFC divisional game, rather, this weekend had Dick Enberg and Dan Dierdorf on the announcing call. I looked that up really quick because I wondered, who was the other team that had the other divisional game if you had Nantz in the studio. But on the broadcast, Simms and Gumbel, I thought overall did a solid job. I mean, I didn't really have any qualms. I liked Simms. I also like Romo, who's now obviously CBS's number one color guy.
Yeah.
But I thought there were some, we'll get to their reaction to the tuck rule and that whole play and that whole sequence a little bit later. But I thought overall they did a solid job. Armin Katayan, I forgot he even did sideline.
Yeah.
When I think of him on Real Sports on HBO.
Yeah, he's more of a reporter now and authored some pretty good books. But yeah, I don't remember him as much on the sideline during this time. And this broadcast, of course, 2001 season, 2002, the actual game was played early 2002, but this game was still in SD. So it's kind of weird going back and watching that with the graphics and everything. I mean, compared to our first episode with that BCS National Championship game, and just a few years later, production was completely different. So that's a little look at the broadcast. The coaches in this game are exactly the same as what we have today. We've taken a different route to get there, but Bill Belichick for the Patriots, John Gruden for the Raiders. He is now back, returned to that sideline with the Raiders as well. But I think the biggest story was how loaded that New England team was in terms of assistant coaches.
Of course. I mean, you had Charlie Weiss. Was there ever an assistant coaching staff that made more money than this one? I mean, you had Charlie Weiss, who's still getting paid by 2 or 3 teams. You had Romeo Crennel, right, who ended up being a head coach in the league, and also now still a coordinator in the league.
Uh-huh.
And back then it was, the Belichick disciples who were disciples of Parcells. It was the whole coaching tree sort of storyline that plays out in a lot of these games. And although those guys would probably go on to, I think the popular opinion is they underwhelmed a little bit as head coaches. I mean, they were excellent coordinators. This Patriots team was not overwhelmingly talented.
No, and if you look on the defensive side of the ball, of course we got a lot of face time with Cornell and Weiss primarily, but you look on the defensive side, you had Rob Ryan was the outside linebackers coach, Eric Mangini was the defensive backs coach, Brian Daboll was a coaching assistant on the defensive side of the ball. So that defensive side was absolutely stacked with coaches that would go on to bigger and better things. Some of them returned back to the assistant ranks, but still, all those guys at some point were one of the hot names in football, whether pro level or Daboll, who assisted in Alabama for a year before going back to the pros. So that was what I thought about when I saw that New England team. Was I remember this is that coaching tree was always what was talked about, and those guys became the hot names throughout, and that was the case in this game for sure. Was there anything about the Oakland coaches? I mean, to me, it was just Gruden, but any takeaways you had from their coaching staff?
I mean, it's hard to supplant Gruden in terms of every time anything happened in the game. I mean, still this is the case, but even back then, anytime anything happened in the game that could somewhat be very positive or very negative for the Raiders, the camera just goes right to Gruden.
Right.
I think you forget how popular he was back then and how popular he continues to be now. He's just one of these guys. I don't know if it's the facial expressions. I don't know if it's because they know they're always going to get a reaction. But again, like you said, he overshadows everyone in that organization. I mean, including Al Davis, which is hard to do. And Al Davis was a huge personality. But, with staying with the coaching staff, Gruden he was the guy.
He was the guy. Player-wise, so this team, of course, it wasn't that long ago, but many of the faces that were on the field for this game have long since retired. Of course, a couple guys with the Patriots still around, but for the most part, all these guys were guys that we grew up watching, probably in high school, and really pulling for, which was a different dynamic watching this game. But to me, the big things I noticed were New England, their linebackers, Bruschi and Vrabel. I mean, these guys were two of the best of the time. I mean, the other takeaway, I thought Antoine Smith, I totally forgot about Antoine Smith, a running back, but he was pretty good around this late 90s, early 2000 seasons. He was a pretty strong running back.
Yeah, if you remember, he was on the Bills at one point, and the Bills pretty much gave up on him. And then he makes his way to the Patriots, and of course, looks like Earl Campbell in his games.
We've heard that story before, right?
Of course. And you see all these other guys like you mentioned, Vrabel, Bruschi, even Willie McGinnis, guys that were a part of this Patriots run here, right? And those guys eventually parlaying that into still being involved in our lives, right? I mean, Bruschi on the analysis end, Vrabel as a coach, Brady obviously still as a player, and McGinnis as an announcer, as an analyst. You have a lot of these guys that stayed in the public eye for a very long period of time because of the success this team had, and that success can all be traced back to this game.
For the Raiders, it was wide receivers, right? Tim Brown, Jerry Rice was finishing up his career with the Raiders, and I'd forgot. I mean, I remember Rich Gannon, but I forgot really how good he was in the NFL at this time. Like, he was one of the top, 3 quarterbacks, would you say, at this time? Or is that a little high?
Rich Gannon was the quarterback headliner in this game. I mean, Tom Brady before this, nice story, comes in relief of Drew Bledsoe. But like you said before, his first playoff game going up against Rich Gannon, who came into this game with playoff experience. So, yeah, Rich Gannon, I mean, this guy was a top 5 quarterback for at least 4 or 5 years here in the NFL. And you mentioned the surrounding talent around him. I mean, you had Pro Bowlers all around this game, whether it was Tim Brown, Jerry Rice, obviously. And there was other guys than those Hall of Famers, though, that really shined out of nowhere. On the other, you had Ty Law on the Patriots, Brady. You had Hall of Famers all over the field in this game. I mean, there was guys in this game that made big play after big play that you forgot even existed. I mean, just 2 of them, David Patton and Jermaine Wiggins. How many catches did these guys have for the Patriots in this game?
Yeah, no doubt. I was gonna talk about Pat at one point too, but yeah, I mean, I agree. He was one of those guys that was a perfect Patriots receiver now, right? I mean, these guys that just kind of find their niche on that team and then that franchise and step up and rise to the occasion. I mean, we've seen it year in, year out now and since that time, but at this point, that was pretty new, and we didn't realize exactly what we were seeing. So let's jump into the game and get into it. So my first overall thought on this game was there wasn't a lot of big plays. I mean, sure, the weather was awful. It snowed the entire game. There wasn't a lot of options for these coaches in terms of opening up the playbook very much. But to me, it was overall just kind of a forgettable game, taking away the final few minutes of it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you saw in the first half something we never see this day and age, and that was I don't want to say a flustered Tom Brady, but after that interception that he threw in the first half, you even heard the announcers sort of making comments in regards to him having to get over that interception and sort of it being a learning moment for him, and could he come back from it? That's something that by the end of the game, that narrative completely changed.
Yeah, it did completely. And early on in this game, there weren't a ton of big plays, but I think one of the things that caught my attention early on was I think it might have been the first drive of the game, the Raiders taking the ball down. They had to play an out to Tim Brown on the sideline. He gets what looks to be a first down. His forward progress gets him about a yard past, it seemed like. He gets pushed back out of bounds behind the first down line. So they say it was fourth down. They go to the review. That whole process takes place. And keep in mind, this was only about 2 years into that new challenge rule. So this new challenge rule was brand new to everybody for the most part. So they reviewed it. They changed the spot by like a half a yard, but didn't get in the first down. And I thought it was pretty funny because nobody had a clue whether or not the Raiders should keep their lose their timeout. It was, so what just happened here? Nope, the spot was changed, so he was technically right in his review. Well, the call wasn't overturned because it's still fourth down, so he loses his timeout. So the referee actually said on the field, timeout is charged to the Raiders, and then the following play they come back and say, no, that is actually not correct. In fact, it is a good review, and they actually got that timeout back. So I just thought it was weird in that situation, seeing that challenge being so confusing and nobody really knowing what was going on.
Yeah, I think Sims overall, great announcer, like I said before, in my eyes. But he was confused on this, and so was Gumbel. I think the crux of it was they won the review, but the review still didn't put the ball where it needed to be a first down. So, yeah, and it's one of those things where this day and age, the announcers are, like you said, are so well-versed on this stuff that they would have knew that stuff cold. But again, the replay came about in the late 90s, early 2000s, and maybe some of the announcers not fully experiencing a lot of these different situations that come up with the replay.
Yeah, and the referees too, in that same thought. But looking at this first half, the other big thing that stood out to me was the fact that the Patriots fans started booing probably early second quarter. You started hearing the boos kind of coming down because the offense was going nowhere, and they steadily got louder from about early second quarter up into the fourth quarter. Boo, 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 after every single offensive possession when the Patriots failed to get into field goal range.
Not only did you hear the boos until, like you said, early fourth quarter, but you also could pick up on the microphone occasionally Bledsoe chants. And I think it's important to mention Drew Bledsoe, who was the number one pick of the Patriots in the mid-90s, led them to a Super Bowl as well. And he was the starting quarterback to begin the year. And Tom Brady comes in for him week 2 after the Jets' Mo Lewis hits Bledsoe on the sideline. Bledsoe is injured. Brady comes in. The rest is sort of history. But I think that's something to definitely keep in mind here, is that there were still Patriots fans that maybe weren't 100% sold on Brady like the coaching staff was.
Right. No question. I mean, nobody had any idea, but isn't that so New England, though, to be booing that team in that environment, in the playoff, first game of the playoff, and it's a one-possession game the entire time, and the other team isn't moving the ball either. I mean, there's a couple plays the Raiders made, but for the most part, these two teams were even. Sure, Brady wasn't sharp, but I mean, you're talking about a guy playing in his first ever playoff game, and this is how the fans were reacting.
And not only this team came out of nowhere. This 11-5 season was completely unexpected for the Patriots. And you remember, you're dealing with a New England fan base here, though, that's pre-2004 Red Sox World Series run, So you're dealing with a sports fan base overall that's used to waiting for that other shoe to drop.
Very frustrated fan base, no doubt. At that time. The game also, the first score of the game, you could have picked any receiver to make a catch to score off of that Raiders roster. You probably wouldn't have picked James Jett, but he was the guy that got in the end zone first out of that group that included Brown and Rice. I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, and the announcers were right on it, though. You had Jerry Porter, who I had completely forgotten about. Mm-hmm. He got hurt earlier in the game, which is the only reason why Jett was even in the game. I think they said previous to that, Jett had 2 catches for 19 yards the entire season.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. But he stepped up at the right time, and he had a pretty good career, right? I mean, he went on to do a few things.
Yeah, he was solid, serviceable pro, and probably his best moment is catching this touchdown.
Yeah. Well, before we get into the second half of this, a couple of outdated items I thought were very interesting. First, the Nextel halftime report. Did you have a Nextel phone? Do you even remember a Nextel
I was chirping.
phone?
I was chirping people left and right.
Okay, you do remember. Yes, the chirp. You had to hit that button like a walkie-talkie. Yeah, we had friends. We both did growing up with this phone. It didn't last for very long, but apparently it was still around in 2002. The other thing that I noticed was the score graphic. And this, CBS, what they do is they kind of animate in the score graphic. They don't have a running bottom line. They might now, but this time they didn't. So when it animated in, two things I noticed. First thing was the American flag in the upper left-hand corner. This was post 9/11, 4 or 5 months after 9/11. So the heightened tensions, the patriotism was really front and center at that time, because you don't ever see that anymore. So it kind of took me back to that moment. The other thing was, in the bottom line, I don't know if you caught this, and I didn't catch it originally. My wife actually pointed it out as we were watching it. The America Online keyword they were promoting for more coverage and more commentary on the Super Bowl and the playoffs. Did you see that?
I did see that. I saw the America Online keyword I noticed on that graphic. I noticed that, I don't know if it was CBS that owned the domain name superbowl.com.
Right.
I don't know if that's CBS or the NFL, but that's amazing. Great job by them. And also, I don't know if you noticed them touting Jay Glazer on that graphic as well.
I
as
did.
their insider.
I thought Jay Glazer came around about 8 to 10 years ago, like around 2010. I didn't think he was around nearly 20 years prior to us recording this episode. I had no idea.
That's wild. How old is Jay Glazer? He can't be any older than 45, 50, right?
How old was he when he was doing this show? Was he 20 years old when he was the insider for CBS in the playoff coverage? That's
good
amazing.
for him, though.
Yeah, great for him.
He is. At least to me, he is the standard for those insiders. So maybe it makes sense. He's been doing it the longest.
Yeah, and now that superbowl.com, I don't know who owned it at the time, but now that redirects to NFL.com/Super Bowl. So I don't know what happened with that, but whoever had it at the time probably got paid pretty nicely for that domain. But I digress. Back to the game. We moved to the second half on this game and really get into where this game really turned the corner and why we're actually talking about this game. So before that tuck rule thing, the Raiders kind of controlled this game start to finish. Charlie Garner, by the way, had a really good game. Very strong running back. Was impressed with the way he played. But then you kind of saw as that fourth quarter began, Tom Brady, just like he has ever since, and I'm sure this is opening up some deep wounds for you, but he turned it on, and it was just automatic, like clutch gene kicked in, and it was a totally different quarterback, confidence level, and everything just seemed to click as soon as that fourth quarter began.
If you take Tom Brady's career and look at it, where he sort of turned the corner and started to grow the legend of Tom Brady was that drive at the beginning of the fourth quarter that went 10 plays, 67 yards, and Brady going 9 for 9 on that drive. That's sort of where Tom Brady turned from a inexperienced young quarterback in his first playoff game to Tom effing Brady. Right. This is where that whole switch started to happen. Would he have, would he play great, here on out in this game? He had some moments where he missed some passes, but that drive just seemed like certain things clicked with him. And we talked about it before, but, those drives were led by the pass catching of Patton and Wiggins, and you mix in a little J.R. Redmond, who I haven't heard his name in a long time. We mentioned Antoine Smith before. He was a factor in the first half, but when they went to a pass-heavy attack here in the second half, again, it was out of the backfield. It was largely Redmond and Kevin Falk.
Yeah, and Brady on that drive too. His receivers seemed to make every single catch they got near them. A tip ball off a fellow receiver fell in the hands of one guy going out of bounds. A high pass was brought in by a short receiver. Everything that needed to happen began happening, and it kind of feels like that all kind of began with Brady, and he kind of brought it all together. But it was wild watching that happen because we've seen it so much since the same story play out, and then it got us all the way down to that key drive. And really, I don't know where to start with this play. The Patriots were driving pretty well. They seemed to have a little momentum, but that drive was stalling out a little bit. The Raiders weren't giving up a lot of ground, and then the blitz happens, a great play call on defense. And you had Woodson coming off the edge on the blind side, knocking that ball loose, and it changed the course of history and within that 1 second when that play took place.
It really did. And everyone on that field's reaction, from Brady to his teammates to Woodson and his teammates, everyone's reaction was acting as if that was a fumble. And you even include the announcers in that sentiment as well. Everyone on a snap look at that play before we started looking at the replay, everyone thought that was a fumble.
I was going to say the same thing. That was the first thing I noticed too, was that the look of dejection from Tom Brady as he walked off the field knowing that he fumbled that football. His teammates, the sideline, and the opposite side of that, the Raiders were so ecstatic and elated that they were moving on in the playoffs, a step closer to the Super Bowl. They felt like then all of a sudden it was like time stopped. This play is under review. And I don't think anybody expected it to happen. Now, there was one highlight that kind of caught him off guard, but I even think that highlight when they first noticed that his arm was going forward, that might even been after the review even started. So it wasn't like anybody in real time had any inkling of a clue that this call was questionable. I mean, in everybody's mind, it was a clear fumble.
This is one of those plays where it still mystifies me how it wasn't a fumble, because I don't understand how the quarterback's intent with the football. His intent was clearly not to throw the ball. It's like clear as day. I think even, you've heard countless people interviewed about this game, and that's what they all come back to. But the rule has nothing to do with intent, which is a typical NFL rule. It leaves a huge gray area. The NFL, both on and off the field, operates in some pretty big gray areas, and this was just one of them. And it was one of those things in the moment where you're like, you didn't really know how much it was going to mean in the moment.
Yeah, you didn't at all. And with 150 left in the game, I mean, this was the game indeed. And I still can't get over it. And I even looking back at that replay, a couple of things that also caught my attention was that today might even be a hands to the face on Woodson as he comes in and swipes at the ball. He hits Brady's helmet first, and his arm slides down to knock the ball loose. I don't know if that would be hands to the face today with the way the quarterbacks are protected. It might even be, and that might even not even be a fumble. And then Brady tried to trip the defensive lineman that was trying to fall on the football. I don't know if you noticed that, but he kicked his leg up to try to trip the guy, and I didn't think that got much attention at all. That's something pretty much considered a no-no in terms of sportsmanship these days. But at the time, that's what Brady, you could tell he thought it was a fumble because he even went to that level to try to prevent the defense from recovering the ball.
Yeah, he legit walked off the field with his head down. There was no running over to the ref. Hey, my arm was going forward, and then it never stopped, and the tuck rule. Like no one was, there was no one on the Patriots team. Bill Belichick wasn't ranting and raving about this. Even though I heard in subsequent interviews that he was pretty confident that the play would be reversed because of prior similar instances they had earlier in the season with the same kind of plays. But in the moment, no one was was in the ref's face saying anything. The review happened because it was the last 2 minutes of the game. Now, who knows if the Patriots would have had it reviewed? I'm sure they would have. No reason for them not to. But this is one of those automatic booth reviews because it was under 2 minutes left.
Yeah, so gets overturned after a lengthy review process and a lot of reviews, every single angle possible we looked at it. But credit Brady and credit the Patriots because they still had to go down the field and still navigate that snow and that weather to try to get into field goal range. They made a couple of plays from there, and then it came down to the kick that still gets talked about. I wouldn't say it's overlooked in this game because of the tuck rule, but it kind of plays second fiddle to what happened just, a minute before that. But in your mind, is that the greatest, maybe not ever, but at least of our lifetime, the greatest field goal that we've seen?
So in the moment, you're not thinking that when he's lining up for the field goal. And you're talking about a guy in Vinatieri who kicked a lot of big field goals in his life. I mean, 3 weeks later in the Super Bowl, he's kicking the game winner there. 2 years later versus the Panthers in the Super Bowl, he's kicking another game winner. But I think if you take all the elements into consideration, the length of the kick into consideration, 45 yards, I think it was the greatest kick in NFL history, especially when you consider the fact that it was a playoff game and all that was at stake. And what's lost in this game is that you had Sebastian Janikowski in his rookie year hitting 2 huge field goals in the third quarter to put them up 13-3. He had a field goal from 38 and 45 yards respectively. That gets completely lost. I had forgotten all about that because of what was to come with Vinatieri. And I was just, ice water in his veins, man. He nailed it. And that for sure is a moment that although, non-Patriots fans may think about the tuck rule, I'm sure if you ask Patriot fans, one of the first things that comes to mind is that field goal.
Yeah, and I forgot it was 45 yards. I was thinking it was more like a 35 to 40 yard field goal. But I mean, a 45-yard field goal in good conditions is not an automatic field goal. And to make it like he did, but thankfully they had the wind to their back which was another big part of this all kind of working together and everything coming together for the Patriots, was that snow was going sideways across the screen. So they even pointed that out, like they got the wind behind it. So it's not going to be as difficult, but still an incredible catch. And then, of course, they go to overtime. Patriots win the coin toss, and it was still sudden death. So first team that scores wins, no matter how they score. Patriots go right down the field, hand it over to Vinatieri again, and they kick the game-winning field goal to win that game in overtime and move on in the playoffs, knocking the Raiders out and beginning the run for Tom Brady and Bill Belichick that is still ongoing today, Mike. I'm sorry, but it is. It's happening, but that's the game. That's how it played out, and it was pretty incredible.
Brady goes, this is where the legend of Tom Brady really kicks into high gear. 8 for 8 in overtime, including a 4th down conversion. Because like you had mentioned with the wind, now the Raiders got to pick the end of the field. So they were in a similar situation where they could have attempted a 44, 45-yard field goal in overtime, decided not to. They convert the 1st down. Then they get into a situation where they have a much shorter field goal for Vinatieri. I believe it was like 23 to 25 yards in that area.
Yeah.
And obviously from that range is a sure thing for Vinatieri, who of note is that coming into this game, he missed 4 of his previous 5 field goals from 40 to 49 yards, which is he goes from that to being undoubtedly the best clutch kicker, in the history of football.
Yeah.
So it's incredible. So many, like we talked about before, there's so many wide-ranging ramifications from this game. But obviously the biggest takeaway is you have this guy who comes in week 2, replacing an injured quarterback in Drew Bledsoe. And, from that point on, until his current day, he's continued to dominate the NFL, and it's completely mind-boggling. Because if you remember, the conversation, for a while was, is Tom Brady that good? I don't know if you remember those conversations, but that was a conversation for a while. Did he just get lucky in these games against the here in this game against the Raiders and the Super Bowl against the Rams? Because the next year they didn't make the Super Bowl. So that was a conversation that was being had. He blew all that to smithereens with the seasons he had in 2003 and 2004. But again, looking back, you saw these early signs of him just being Tom Brady, man.
So let's take it to post game and talk about the aftermath and what happened as a result of this one call that overturned a fumble and ruled an incomplete pass. So I want you to rant on this more because you probably have a better understanding of how this kind of played out. But this is the beginning of the Patriots dynasty. They've gone on since. And I even think, and you kind of touched on this briefly earlier, this was kind of the beginning and really kind of catapulted the entire city, because when New England won the Super Bowl, the city's last championship came back in 1986, okay? The Celtics won their last one. You didn't have the Patriots were winning. The Red Sox had the longest drought ever. I mean, you forget about that now, but since that time, in 17 years, the Patriots have won 6 Super Bowls. The Red Sox have won 4 World Series. The Bruins have won a Stanley Cup, and the Celtics have won an NBA title. I'm not going to say that won't happen if this game doesn't occur, but them kind of getting that monkey off the city's shoulder absolutely help open everything up for everyone.
Yeah, this is where it all started. I mean, the run that the city's sports run sort of mirrored this run by the Patriots. Obviously, culminating with the Super Bowl win a couple weeks later against the Rams. But we talked about it before, how different you thought of Boston fans before the Tuck Rule game was. All these people who are always going to find a negative in everything, right? They're never happy. They're never this. They're never that. That whole mindset begins to flip with this game.
Yeah, and people forget that now because they've seen Boston win so much. But that city was, I won't call it a loser city, but I'll call it a loser city. I mean, that's kind of what the feeling was around their sports team. Was there was no confidence. The Patriots were a laughingstock. The Red Sox were just had a great ballpark and a lot of tradition, but nothing more. I mean, the Celtics were on the drought, longing for the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And the Bruins, I mean, I'm not going to talk about hockey too much. I didn't follow it that much. But overall, that city as a whole just didn't have that feel. There was no confidence. Like, you meet a guy from Boston now, he's going to tell you about his teams, right? It wasn't like that then.
Yeah, he might tell you about the Celtics in the 80s and Larry Bird and Bill Russell and Bob Cousy.
Love Kevin
But
McHale.
nothing that he actually saw happen,
Yeah, exactly. But that changed everything. And it's probably not great for us as sports fans having to deal with those people now, but it is what it is. So, looking at how this game and kind of the aftermath, how it kind of changed the course of history. So talk to me about what you think would have happened if this call goes the other way. And let's start with Tom Brady. What do you think happens to Tom Brady? Does his career change? Obviously, he has one less Super Bowl, right? Because they don't win this year. But does this whole next 2 decades look the same, or at least pretty close?
There's some speculation. I heard, some interviews with people in and around this game saying, if this tuck rule call goes the other way, then Tom Brady is a quarterback who lost a home playoff game versus a West Coast team in the snow. And does he even start the next year? Or does Drew Bledsoe get a starting job back? I think that's ridiculous. With the way Tom Brady played overall in this game, played the whole season, I think he's still the Patriots starting quarterback. But what you can have a big what if about is, like I mentioned, the next year, the Patriots don't reach the Super Bowl. And in 2003 is really when Brady takes it to the next level. It's not just about the defense carrying Brady. The change starts to happen where Brady's carrying the defense. And you can make an argument, does that transition happen as quick? Is he as confident going into that Panthers Super Bowl? You could have that argument, but overall, I just think a guy like Brady, it would have been a matter of time before he broke through. Now, to this degree, who knows? There are a lot of other things that contributed to the Patriots' consistency here over the years. But I think we're still talking about the same level of greatness from Brady, whether this tuck rule is ruled on a different way or not.
Who wins the Super Bowl that year, do you think? Yeah, right. The Patriots go on to beat the Steelers and then beat the Rams. Who do you think ends up winning the Super Bowl that year?
I think the Rams win the Super Bowl that year. The Rams were overwhelming. That's another offense that you tend to forget about. But, it's widely thought to be the best 2 or 3 year run by an offense in NFL history. I think the Rams win if the Patriots don't get there.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. What other ramifications came from this game?
Well, you could argue bigger ramifications happened in the direct and future aftermath with the Raiders. I mean, a month after this game happens, the Raiders trade John Gruden to the Buccaneers for 2 first-round picks, 2 second-round picks, and $8 million in cash. Then the next year, the Raiders, led by Bill Callahan now, played John Gruden and his Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the Buccaneers absolutely trounced the Raiders in the famous game where Bill Callahan didn't change any of the formations or any of the plays in that Super Bowl, apparently, and Gruden knew exactly what was coming. So in a direct aftermath, you have that happen. And then for the future, the Raiders, after that Super Bowl, they don't make the playoffs again until the year a couple years ago where the Derek Carr Khalil Mack team goes 12-4. Derek Carr gets hurt at the end of the year, and they lose in the wild card round to the Texans. So this game had huge ramifications on the Raiders, who they even made remarks in the broadcast. They were one of the oldest, if not the oldest team in the league during this season. They just absolutely collapsed as an organization after making the Super Bowl that next season.
Yeah, it was like that team was built for this small window of time. Gannon won the MVP the year after this, right? I mean, when he led to his team to the Super Bowl, he won the MVP. They still had the talent at wide receiver. Rice was still finishing up his career. Still had a pretty good year or 2 left in him. But yeah, I mean, after that finished off and they lost that Super Bowl, that franchise as we know it has been completely different. And, they're still hoping to rebound, this year and maybe turn around, and even had to go back to John Gruden years later, 16 years later, back to that same head coach that got him to this point. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And some other guys from this game that kind of went on. I mean, there's not a whole lot else we can add. Troy Brown, a guy that was huge in this run through this playoff. He had another good year after this, but then after 2002, he only started 22 games over the next 4 seasons, kind of faded out as it's kind of part of this whole Patriots interchanging the wide receivers and just kind of plugging a guy in there for Brady. But really, I tried to look at what storylines may have come from some of these guys, but there wasn't anybody really else that stood out to me in terms of how their career went or really fell off or exploded from this game.
The only guy I can think of besides Brady whose career exploded was obviously Ty Law from the Patriots standpoint, because then in these subsequent years, you have the Ty Law, Peyton Manning, chucking guys at the line of scrimmage, that whole dynamic that played out for 2 or 3 years. And then obviously from this moment on, you had Charles Woodson just ascend. Charles Woodson, who, obviously made the hit on Brady in this game, just ascend to being, an all-pro throughout most of the first half of his career. But outside of those stars, you either had older players on the Raiders that sort of faded out, or you had players on the Patriots that were thought to be good system players and not, maybe not great individually. So didn't get the individual hype, but were essential to them winning. And that's really been the hallmark of the Patriots dynasty, right? You have Brady and Belichick and a bunch of interchangeable parts over the years. I mean, some of those guys have ascended to be Pro Bowl type players, all pro type players in any given 4 or 5 year stretch. but that's sort of what the Patriots dynasty has been known for.
Yep. Going social for this game. I mean, I think it's pretty clear what would have been the big moments in this game in terms of social media if it was around at the time. It would have been blowing up with the absurdity of that review that would have been trending immediately across the country and probably worldwide with that play and that play call. But also think another aspect of this, kind of playing off of the way the fans are reacting, is I think there would have been a lot of calls in the moment for fans to bench Brady and play Bledsoe. I think that would have been a big part of the conversation on social media.
I have 3 big social media takeaways from this one, okay? Things that would have killed on social media.
All right.
Number 1, obviously the tuck rule. That would have been, no one would have known what was going on. Everyone would have been confused. Everyone would have been, Mr. Johnny rule book and and looking up the rule, on the internet and saying, and giving their hot takes on the rule. Secondly, I don't know if you caught this, but the drive before the tuck rule drive for the Patriots, it was a very quick drive. It was like a 50-second 3-and-out drive for the Patriots. And Phil Simms actually got hit with a snowball in the booth.
I did not.
I don't know if you caught that or not.
I didn't. Wait. So was this part of the broadcast?
It was. The broadcast that I listened to is the CBS broadcast, and you hear Phil Simms make a noise and make a comment that he got hit by a snowball in the middle of the broadcast. And he even mentioned that he saw the guy who did it.
I don't know how I missed that.
Yeah, it was during a pretty crucial part of the game. Again, it was right at the end of that really quick drive, because what happened is, the Patriots had a 3-and-out. They then punted to the Raiders, which I get to my third big social media outcry of this game would have been, the Raiders have the ball there right before the drive before they punted to the Patriots for the tuck rule drive. They had 2 great runs by Charlie Garner to set them up for a 3rd and 1. The Patriots begin using their timeouts during this time. And instead of giving the ball to Charlie Garner, who's been great the whole game, they give the ball to Zach Crockett, who doesn't get the first down. And then they punt to the Patriots, who end up getting a very strong punt return. And then from there, the whole tuck rule drive plays out. I think people would have been killing Gruden for not sticking with Charlie Garner, who was very good all day.
We would have also had that video of that snowball on Twitter, too. Somebody would have recorded that. We would have actually seen Phil Simms getting hit with a snowball had social media existed at that time. So that's unfortunate. I can't believe I missed that. I'm going to go back and actually look at that. But you mentioned Charlie Garner. Let me ask you real quick if you know this. Career rushing yards for Charlie Garner, who had a pretty good day in this game. How many do you think he had?
Career rushing yards for Charlie Garner?
Yeah.
I'd probably say about 5,000.
7,097 for Charlie Garner. I thought it was a random
stat.
Look at that.
I would have never guessed that. I think the Jets had this stretch where they, like I mentioned before, where they just played the Raiders at the Raiders every year. The only 3 or 4 years the Raiders have been good in the last 20 years. The Jets played at the Raiders probably 4 or 5 times, and Charlie Garner, when he was on the team, killed them. The week before this, he rushed for 160 yards. Rice caught 180 yards worth of balls, and they beat the Jets in a higher scoring game. But Charlie Garner, very underrated running back, because I had no clue he rushed for that many yards.
Yeah, indeed. So last thing we'll do here, what if I told you, Mike? I'm going to throw out one. If you have one, throw it back at me. What if I told you Tom Brady, the guy that struggled for 3 quarters in this game in his first career playoff game, would go on to win 30 playoff games and 6 Super Bowls after this performance?
What if I told you, Ben, sort of piggybacking on that Bill Belichick, thought to this time to just be a disciple of Bill Parcells, can he ever be as good as Bill Parcells, has not only passed Bill Parcells, but what if I told you he surpassed every coach in NFL history and now stands alone as the best coach in NFL history. And he also stands alone in how much over the years he's treated reporters. Because I don't know if you noticed the beginning of this game, he did the, hey, let's talk to the coach before the game interview. And he was nice and cordial to Armin Katan, which I don't think he would ever in a million years agree to that interview today.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, too. He actually opened up a little bit and talked about the game plan and what he expected. Never would do that again. But you're right there. What if I told you, though, that out of this entire coaching staff, no one would go on to be a good head coach anywhere else outside of working under Bill Belichick?
Honestly, I would have been very surprised. What if I told you that Charlie Weiss would not only become a head coach, but he'd have several head coaching jobs, and he'd maybe be the richest non-Tom Brady, non-Bill Belichick part of this entire game?
I wouldn't have believed it, but I guess that is the case. I mean, when you think about it, I'm going to flip it to Oakland real quick. And what if I had told you after this game, after this team fell really one play short of advancing and maybe eventually getting to a Super Bowl and then going back again the next year, this team would only have 2 winning records over the next 17 years of football?
That this is one of those storylines of this game that never gets talked about. And I was hoping you'd hit on this, but just the Raiders, I mean, they just completely, after that next year, after that loss to Gruden and the Bucs just completely ripped the soul out of them.
Yep.
It's incredible what it's done to that franchise. You got into the later years with Al Davis, an icon in the NFL. And I don't mean anything really bad by this, but maybe losing it a little bit and making some decisions that sort of steered the franchise in the wrong direction with several bad coaching hires and even more bad draft picks. And this was really, his last big chance at a Super Bowl run, and it fell apart so quickly.
Yeah, it did for sure. So any final thoughts on this game, on what you thought about it, how it held up, just any final thoughts before we wrap up this episode?
Just, this is one of those games where we could have a 2-hour podcast, and I don't think we can cover all the fallout from this game and all the things that it led to within the league, and all of the impact it still has in the league today. And it wasn't even a Super Bowl. You're talking about a divisional championship game where the Patriots still had to go on the road and beat the Steelers the next week. But just looking back, I mean, just a jaw-dropping game.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important games of the NFL that wasn't a championship. I mean, it might be the most important game that did not have a championship on the line when you go back and look at it and think about it. But I mean, I didn't think overall the game was that exciting. I mean, it had its moments. It was probably more exciting in the moment because you didn't know what was going to happen with the snowfall and all that. But overall, after the fact, I mean, you take out that one drive and that one call, we would not even have a second thought. We wouldn't even be able to tell you who was in that divisional playoff game in 2001. You would have no idea. But that's not how it worked out. That's not how it played out. And here we are discussing this game 17 years later and talking about what all it meant. So a pretty fun one to go back and watch for sure. And I'm glad we went back and did that because it opened my eyes to a few new things and made me appreciate this. And you should admit this too, Mike. Best to open up. It's therapeutic. But Tom Brady really is a special player. He
is. I mean, I'm done fighting that fight a long time ago. I'm defeated as far as that goes. I mean, it's one of these things where we're just waiting for him to retire. Yeah. And hopefully Belichick goes with him, and I can go back to hating the Dolphins.
The Bills just get left behind again. Let's wrap it up on that note, Mike. I appreciate the time. And let me remind everybody to join the conversation on Twitter at Distant Podcast. Email us your thoughts or email us a game you want to talk about or us to talk about and have a discussion on this podcast at distantreplay@gmail.com. And then also visit the website, distantreplaypodcast.com. We're going to have some show notes to where you can go listen to the episode, but you also go back and watch the game. We'll have a link to the game there, the video that you can actually watch, and maybe a couple screenshots from the game and other thoughts that we picked up on and observations we made over the course of rewatching this game once again for the Distant Replay podcast. So we got another big game coming up next. We will not reveal it, but you have to subscribe to find out what it is. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or whatever your podcasting app of choice is, and leave us a review if you would. But please subscribe so you can be alerted the next time we release a podcast. We'll try to do that every single week. So, Mike, appreciate it, man. Enjoyed this game. It was fun going back and looking at this one more time with you.
Absolutely, Ben. Pleasure as always. And a hint for next week, wide right.
Opening the door, giving them a little teaser. I like it, my friend. Well, let's wrap it up on that note. Thank you for listening. Subscribe. This is Distant Replay. We'll talk to you next time.